Recently, I received a friend request that reminded me of this story, so I'm going to share it here. This happened after I went to university, so I was 18 years old. I made an effort to make friends after moving to campus and ended up with a few groups to hang out with, including a new girlfriend and quite a few people from my classes that I liked. There was a class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterward to eat in pairs or trios. I wasn't too picky about who I had lunch with because I got along well with most of the people in the class, and we were all trying to make an effort to be social. So when a girl named Marina asked if I wanted to have lunch together after that class, I had no reason not to go. We talked about school and that kind of stuff, but nothing noteworthy. However, she asked me to have lunch together again the following week. It became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to suddenly start saying no. It was fine, but that didn't mean I missed the chance to have lunch with anyone else those days. In retrospect, I guess that was the point. One day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media. This happened in front of Marina, and I saw her face snap towards me from a couple of seats away. It was such an abrupt reaction that it was hard to ignore, and I still remember it. By the time I got home that day, Marina had sent me a friend request. We didn't have any mutual friends, and I didn't know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess she just looked through the university's social media pages and found me there. It gave me a bad feeling, but surely it was fine. She ended up sending me a lot of messages and commenting on everything I posted. I told myself she was just awkward, and we became friends, though not close. I'd met worse people. She always took me to lunch after our shared class, but aside from that, we rarely spent time together in person. I saw her around sometimes, but I never made an effort to hang out with her, so we mostly communicated online and saw each other in groups. Coincidentally, my girlfriend's name was also Marina. This was something that clearly bothered Marina, not my girlfriend, who found it as uninteresting as possible. It's a common name. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to choose another name. She joked about it not suiting her. Clearly, she didn't like my girlfriend at all, and I had an idea why. By this point, it was hard to ignore that Marina was starting to hint that she had a crush on me. I tried not to address it because what was I going to say? I never knew what to do when a friend made a move. Plus, I wasn't interested in the slightest. Even ignoring the weird things she did, Marina wasn't my type at all. She tended to dress and act in a way that oscillated between a 50s housewife and one of those adults still obsessed with Disney princesses. If you can imagine it, things took an uncomfortable turn on the day of our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me to have lunch as she usually did, Marina asked if I wanted to take a walk with her. Once again, I didn't exactly know how to refuse, so I agreed with an okay. Our campus was bordered by a large expanse of woods. Marina led me into the woods, and the sounds of our classmates gradually faded away. She sat on a log, and I joined her. She started talking about how she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried to agree with her, but I didn't want to be there, especially since she seemed almost on the verge of tears. I tried to think of an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could leave, Marina chose to kiss me without warning. It was awkward, to say the least, and I got out of there, happy to think I wouldn't see her for a while. I returned to university after the summer, moving into a house with all my friends. Without going into details, there were some serious problems in my friend group, lots of trivial arguments and concerns. I also broke up with my girlfriend at the start of that school year, and basically the whole mess made me recontextualize things with Marina, because suddenly they didn't seem so bad. That said, I didn't want to be alone with her. We mostly talked online, as she kept sending me messages constantly after all. One advantage of all this was that I started dating a guy, and Marina wasn't too happy to hear that news. I think she had hoped to get closer after I broke up with my girlfriend, but as I said before, that was never going to happen. There wasn't a big interval between my breakup and this new relationship, so she must have thought she'd missed her chance to be with me. Here's where the story gets bad. At that time, I was pretty active on Tumblr and occasionally talked about my life, though mostly I reblogged photos and stuff like that. I was there one day when something strange happened. One of the blogs I followed received a question with a few sentences that I recognized. It took me a second to realize they had been taken from my About page, which left me chilled. I read the message carefully. Someone was asking this completely random person to analyze a section of text from my page, asking their opinion on what kind of person would have written it. I can't emphasize how disturbing it was to see people talking about me as if I were a character in a book they were trying to study. The response was basically, "I don't know, sorry." But the important thing was that the question wasn't anonymous. It was linked to someone's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a strange interest in me. As far as I knew, no one in real life, aside from my boyfriend, knew about my page. Well, no prizes for guessing who was behind this. What I found was like a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognized Marina in all of it. It was a cheesy page, all in red and pink. There were some posts about her interests, but most of the content focused on her main interest, me. Most of the posts were about me. There were accounts of things I had done recently. He told me about such and such, and he went to a nightclub recently, etc., as well as references to things from as long ago as since I met her. It was clear she had been watching me both online and offline, gathering every scrap of information she could about my life and hoarding them here in her collection. This was something straight out of the deep web. She talked about how we ate together and how special our dates had been for her, as if it were more than just acquaintances having lunch after class. She talked about the time she had forced a kiss on me in the woods, but she wrote it as if it had been mutual. She quoted lyrics from my favorite song and talked about how she would always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me just as I am, which answered another mystery about an anonymous love letter I had received earlier that year with the same wording. It got worse. There were many posts about my boyfriend, too. These weren't as nice. They were vicious, talking about how he didn't deserve me, how he didn't know what he had, and how if she were with me, she would be jealous of anyone who came near me. So my boyfriend hadn't been a jealous person. That meant he didn't love me, according to her. It was a message full of anger and hatred. Now, I didn't like to think about the kind of person who could write so obsessively, fixated on me. One thing that didn't make sense at first was that the blog also made many references to Marina's best friend, Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me. Her post talked a lot about Steven, how good a friend he was, how much fun they had together, how he took care of her, etc. I was trying to figure out if he was an online friend when a specific post made everything click. She had posted a picture and captioned it with something like, "Steven sent me this, he knew I'd love it." The problem was that the photo had been taken from my own page. I hadn't sent it to her, she had taken it from my page, and then claimed that this fictitious friend of hers had shared it with her because, in her mind, she had split my identity into two people. In her fantasy, delusional life, I was both the perfect best friend who also took care of her and her soulmate, who was destined to be with her once I finally got over my sweet boyfriend and all the easy girls I hung out with, about whom she had made dozens of posts complaining. Who was she complaining to? Oh, Marina had an audience. She had posted open questions about me and her relationship with me, and was receiving messages from her followers, people who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of people agreeing with this stalker, saying that my boyfriend didn't deserve me, and that we were destined to break up soon so I could be with Marina, the person I was clearly meant to be with. She had this fake fictional version of my life ready for everyone to share their opinions, and she had cast herself as the heroine of that story. I scrolled back maybe a month in the history of that page and didn't look at everything that was there. It wasn't much, so I'm not sure how long this had been going on. I sent Marina a message confronting her about the blog. She didn't say anything. I can't emphasize how strange it was to find pages and pages dedicated to me, with her talking about how she was in love with me and would make sure we ended up together, trashing my boyfriend, and building a fantasy life with two different versions of me in it that she clearly believed were real. And then acting like nothing had happened. She didn't say anything. She didn't address it, change the subject, even after I brought it up, as if she hadn't even registered what I said. I've never seen anything like it. Of course, she deleted the page, or at least changed the name and hid it, so I never found it again. But that wasn't the end. I wasn't going to spend more time with her, but we were still in classes together, and she had started to scare me with what she might do next. I'm a bit paranoid, and knowing that someone had been obsessively watching me for who knows how long made me really uneasy. The next thing she tried was to seduce my boyfriend. It was an utterly useless attempt that only made him feel uncomfortable. He told me about it immediately. What was her plan? Did she hope to tell me that he had cheated on me and expect me to break up with him? Why would I want to be with her after that? When that didn't work, she tried flirting with 3 of my other friends, and none of them took the bait. Finally, she ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but she made sure to send me messages while they were together, letting me know she would rather be with me. No, thank you. Marina made sure to stay in my life for as long as I was at university. There was a time when I tried to distance myself from her, and she ended up spreading rumors about me and damaging a professional opportunity I had put a lot of effort into. I don't know what else she did behind my back, but it made me realize it was safer to let her think she was part of my life while ignoring her rather than doing something to make her angry. After graduation, Marina still wanted to hang out, but I knew I didn't have to. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after that point. I almost stopped posting on the social media she knew about. Of course, she didn't give up that easily. She tried to start conversations, asked me to meet up, attempts that I generally ignored. I didn't like to think that she was still following me online, but she probably was. I don't know how, but occasionally she would reference things I mentioned online somewhere she shouldn't have known about. The last time we had a real conversation, she sent me a message out of the blue. We hadn't talked in months, and we hadn't discussed anything serious in much longer. Thinking about that conversation still gives me chills, but I'll summarize what happened. At first, she asked me a few questions about how long I had known I was gay. I told her some basic things, the kind of stuff I would tell anyone who asked. But then she changed the subject. She started talking about how I would feel about her if she were a guy, about wanting to be a guy for me. The messages quickly got weird. She went into a lot of detail about the fantasies she had of the two of us together. Again, we weren't friends at that point. We had never been very close, at least not from my perspective, and we had barely talked in years. I can't imagine sending messages like that to even a close friend, much less someone who barely knows you. I tried to tell her not to come at me with that nonsense, but she decided to change tactics. She sent pictures of herself, followed by a bunch of messages, maybe 4 or 5 per minute. Too fast for me to respond before the next one arrived. Basically, she was repeating to me what I had told her about myself and my past a few hours earlier. She was telling me these things as if they had happened to her. She was playing my role. The worst part was that she seemed to believe it was real, even when she was quoting me word for word. The things I had told her just hours before were now her life. It was like she was trying to absorb my story, to take over my life, to make my life part of hers. Yeah, I didn't talk to her again after that. I ignored any future attempts she made to talk to me and eventually quietly removed her from my inactive social media, which was her only real way of contacting me. I really thought I could finally move past it. A few days ago, she sent me a friend request. There it is, unanswered, because I know that if I delete it, she'll just send another one. Marina and I met almost 12 years ago. This story is just the highlights, and even so, it's only what I know for sure. I know a lot more happened behind my back. I'm pretty sure everyone on the internet has heard of and used the website called Wikipedia, known as the largest collection of knowledge ever collaboratively accumulated in one place. It is said that Wikipedia is the largest and most read reference work in history. We've all used it for work, school, and even research purposes. As the number of visitors to the website grows every day, so does its popularity. However, what most Wikipedia users don't know is that the website has a truly disturbing and dark side. While everyone is familiar with Wikipedia, few people know about the hidden wiki located on the deep web. This chilling website is inaccessible to the average internet user, as one would need to use the Tor browser to access it. Unlike the free encyclopedia we all know, Wikipedia's dark sibling contains content that will make your stomach turn. The disturbing links on the website lead to hitmen, illegal chemicals, banned weapons, and uncensored content. Because of all this, my experience with the website is truly horrifying, and the story you're about to hear will explain why. I remember that time in school well because it was a period we all called the deep web phase. I can't remember how it started, but every student in school was obsessed with the deep web. My classmates dared each other to enter the deep web, and anyone who didn't was mocked and called a coward. Every new day, a student would come to school with a disturbing story and photos, telling us about the horrors they had seen on the deep web. These stories ranged from seeing people being murdered in the infamous Red Rooms to buying illegal content on the infamous Silk Road. Basically, everyone was doing it, and those who weren't were challenged to do the same. It soon became a sort of sick initiation rite, as using the deep web was considered cool, and it wasn't long before it was my turn. I still remember the fear in my heart that day when my friends dared me to visit the deep web. Even in my late teens, I didn't handle morbid and disturbing content well, so I wasn't sure if I was going to do it. However, I knew that if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to face my friends. Looking back, although I was terrified, the peer pressure to do it was overwhelming. All my friends were experimenting with the deep web, and I told myself that there was no reason why I couldn't do the same. So that day, I gathered the courage and downloaded the anonymous browser called Tor. For those who don't know, the onion routing browser, or Tor as everyone knows it, is one of the few ways to access the deep web. Unlike the common web, the deep web is a disorganized place and can be overwhelming. Google doesn't exist on the deep web, as it has its own strange search engines. There are some popular ones called Not Evil and Torch, which people use to navigate the deep web. But using those search engines can be very complicated for new users, especially if you don't know what to look for. However, there was one particular website that my friends had told me to visit, and that website was called Hidden Wiki. It's a bit difficult to adequately explain what the Hidden Wiki is, as it's not a traditional search engine, but to put it simply, it's essentially a collection of popular links from the deep web. Once I got to the Hidden Wiki website, I came across numerous websites that led to illegal weapons, hard drugs, and uncensored snuff content. There were many links to choose from, as I saw most of the major deep web websites, like the Cannibal Forum, where real-life cannibals discuss how it feels to eat human flesh and fresh organs. I even saw a link to the Human Experiments page, a chilling forum considered one of the most disturbing websites on the deep web. This is because the people behind the website performed morbid experiments on living people. Apparently, there are experimental videos of these people injecting bleach into pregnant women, sterilizing unwilling participants, exposing babies to radiation, and many other horrifying things that I can't even mention. I kept scrolling through the Hidden Wiki website, taking it all in, and for some unknown reason I felt drawn to a particular link called Steak and Cheese. Often called Rotten, this website is known for having a large collection of macabre, violent, and grotesque videos. After clicking on the link, I was taken to the Steak and Cheese homepage. The content I saw there is enough to make any man vomit everything they've eaten that day. I still feel sick recounting the things I saw, as they were practically extreme snuff content. There were numerous videos of children being tortured in chains, most of them no older than 8 years old. Another video called The Divine Banquet showed live cannibalism, depicting a man eating dismembered human parts. The more I explored the website, the more horrified I felt. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I came across a video called True Eaters. I saw the horrifying frames of people in the video happily tearing apart small animals like kittens and rats before devouring the animals' corpses. I had only been on the website for a few minutes, but I already wanted to leave. I was starting to have doubts about all of this, and I didn't think I could watch anymore. But before I could exit, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a link to a video called Miss Necrophilia. From what I could deduce, Miss Necrophilia seemed to be a dancer. She had many videos on her page where she sang songs and danced with what appeared to be plastic mannequins. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't leave the website at that moment. I had already seen more than enough disturbing content, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I felt drawn to the Miss Necrophilia video. It was the only normal video I had seen on the entire Steak and Cheese website, so I gave in and clicked on the video link to watch it in full. At the beginning of the video, the woman I assumed was Miss Necrophilia simply stared at the camera. She had applied a lot of black mascara above and below her eyes. I can still remember the expression in her eyes as she continued to stare at the camera. It's hard to put into words, but her eyes seemed completely empty, as if she had no soul. The video then cut to her living room where she had 4 mannequins propped up on chairs behind her. The living room was better lit, so I could see better. But that's when I noticed something strange about those mannequins. For starters, they looked a little too realistic to be mannequins, as the hair on the mannequin that resembled a man in his 40s seemed a little too real. I had similar thoughts about the other 3 mannequins. The first 2 were mannequins of 2 small children, a boy and a girl, who seemed to be about 9 or 10 years old. As Miss Necrophilia handled the mannequins, I noticed that the movements of her fingers looked strange. I had a feeling in my stomach that something was very wrong. Even with the bizarre way the first 3 mannequins looked, it was the last one that puzzled me the most. This particular mannequin resembled a baby about 10 months old, but what disturbed me the most was that it looked like a life-size doll with an eerie paleness. Miss Necrophilia then picked up the larger male mannequin and began dancing with it while singing a strangely cheerful melody. I couldn't understand what she was singing as the song was in another language, but as she danced and sang with her mannequin, I felt like there was something I wasn't seeing. And that's when I realized. The horrible realization hit me when Miss Necrophilia brought the supposed male mannequin closer to the camera while she danced, and out of the corner of my eye I saw it. There were thousands of maggots crawling all over the male mannequin she was dancing with. That's when my brain finally put the pieces together. They weren't mannequins or life-size dolls, they were corpses. They were stiff and embalmed in some way, which initially made me mistake them for mannequins. If she hadn't brought them closer to the camera, I never would have noticed that they were beginning to rot. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. My mind struggled to comprehend the horrific atrocity I had just seen, and I was frozen in shock. I tried to find an explanation for why a woman would be dancing with decomposing corpses in her own living room, but I couldn't. Things took an even more macabre turn when I noticed the photograph in the background. It was a family photo showing a pregnant Miss Necrophilia, her husband, and their 2 children, all of whom bore a striking resemblance to the corpses. My stomach couldn't take it anymore, and I felt bile quickly rising in my throat. Even after vomiting everything I had eaten, I still couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed in front of the screen and couldn't move my hands to stop the video. Looking back, I don't know how long I was frozen in front of the screen. It could have been 15 minutes or more, but after a while a dialogue box appeared on my screen, and that snapped me out of my horrible trance. The strange chat box was from an anonymous chat room on the deep web, and the message read, "You've been watching this video for a long time, friend. I guess you enjoy Miss Necrophilia's content. I'm a big fan of hers too, you know. She takes requests, and I'm sure Allison will be the perfect candidate to be the next dancing corpse. After all, she takes ballet classes." My heart sank into my stomach when I saw the name Allison, and I let out a guttural scream. I told myself it couldn't be, but I didn't believe in coincidences. Allison was the name of my 12-year-old little sister. I had no idea how the person on the other side of the message knew that, and what disturbed me even more was the fact that she took ballet classes after school, and these took place every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I looked at the date again, and April 16th, 2010 fell on a Friday. With adrenaline and fear surging through my body, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I was talking so fast that I was practically incoherent. Even after my call, the police thought it was a prank, so I immediately called my mother and asked where my sister was. She told me that school had just ended and that she had just dropped her off at ballet class. I then begged her to call the ballet school and confirm that Allison was still there, but when she called, the school told her that Allison was nowhere to be found. All the color drained from my face as I thought the worst. I tried to explain everything, but I couldn't find the words. I knew this wasn't something I could adequately explain over the phone, so I ran to my mother's office. It was pretty close to our house, so I managed to get there in less than 8 minutes. I arrived panting and out of breath, and I took a few seconds to calm down before telling my mother everything. When I finished, my mother came over to me and slapped me across the face. She had never hit me in my life, and I knew exactly why she did. I had just put my little sister's life in danger, and it was all because of a stupid dare. I could see the tears and fear in her eyes as she dialed the emergency number. When the line connected, she calmly told them everything that had happened. They then told us that we had to wait at least 24 to 48 hours before declaring her missing, but my mother pleaded with the officers to do something immediately, as she felt time was of the essence. My mother's old friend, Officer Daniel Barnes, was a police officer and managed to convince them to start the search within an hour. The officers filled the streets with photos of my little sister in hand, asking if anyone had seen her. After telling the officers everything, I also joined the search for my little sister, and with each passing hour, my heart rate increased. We searched for 13 hours straight, covering the entire city, but we found nothing. My mother, who had completely broken down in tears, couldn't look me in the eye. I didn't blame her, as I was the only one at fault. As tensions continued to rise, I started to think the worst, imagining Allison being brutally murdered by psychopaths, and I wondered if I would see her in the next Miss Necrophilia video. Both the officers and the rest of the search team were visibly tired now. They were already starting to slow down, and people wanted to go home and continue tomorrow. But just as the search was about to halt, We received news that she was lying on a bench on the outskirts of the city. We drove as fast as we could until we reached the spot, and my mother cried tears of joy as she held Allison in her arms. The paramedics examined her and said she had been chloroformed but was otherwise okay. When she regained consciousness, we asked her what had happened, and she told us that she had been taken from her ballet class a few minutes after our mother dropped her off. She said she didn't remember much after being grabbed, as everything was blurry, but the one thing she didn't forget was the only thing he said to her. When I asked her what he said, my little sister looked me straight in the eye and said, "Tell Donatello I said hello." This entire incident put the whole town on red alert. Our family had to move in with my mother's sister while the authorities watched our house to ensure it was safe. I was interrogated again, and I told them everything. I also assured them that I had used an anonymous browser. But they told me that didn't matter with the kind of people who lurk on the deep web, as accessing my IP address or my computer's camera and history is easy with the pedigree of hackers that roam the deep web. The detectives believed that this was how they managed to get such personal and privileged information within seconds. The authorities made numerous attempts to track down the unidentified man who had taken my sister. But like everything on the deep web, it was impossible to trace, and no matter how much they tried, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. They also tried to locate Miss Necrophilia, but that also proved impossible, as her videos had been removed from the Steak and Cheese website. As the investigation came to an end and I returned to school, I learned that the whole deep web phase had ended, as both the teachers and the authorities were actively warning students against using or visiting the deep web. It took our family a while to get over that incident. My mother said she had forgiven me, but I will never be able to forgive myself for what I put my family through. So please, to everyone listening, take my story as a warning to stay away from the deep web, because although it may seem fun at first, I know all too well that a simple link on the deep web can leave you scarred for life. A few years ago, I did something terrible. Sometimes I wish I hadn't done it, something I can never undo. Honestly, it all started with my girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, when she broke up with me. I know this might seem trivial and just part of growing up, but unfortunately for me, it had the opposite effect. I know you all will think I'm childish and that I should have just accepted the situation and moved on. You might be right, but I didn't. I helped her with everything in her life. I wasn't going to let that go unpunished. I know it was petty and wrong, but you have to understand, I was desperate. I was hurting. Honestly, it felt like my heart was on fire. It beat so hard that I thought it would explode at any moment. I know it sounds dramatic, and honestly, I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm not the victim here, not anymore. I made sure of that. Honestly, I can feel my body trembling with rage, so I got up with hate and darkness in my heart and turned on my laptop. I wasn't a stranger to the dark web. I had spent countless hours trying and failing to navigate it to relieve my boredom. I'd only found the typical rabbit holes, falling into the usual drug sites and trap forums. I just wanted her to suffer. I wanted her to feel the shame I had felt and suffered at her hands. My original plan, though very unpleasant and wrong, wasn't malicious. It wasn't violent in any way. I just wanted to humiliate her. I still had photos and videos from our time together, personal photos and videos of her. And in my state of repressed anger and depression, I thought it was a good idea to use them against her. Now I see I was wrong from the start, but I wish that's all I had done. As horrible as it sounds, that was nothing compared to what I actually did. I kept searching and searching, clicking link after link until eventually, I clicked on one that caught my attention. It was a forum called The Naughty List. On the site, there was a question. Do you know someone who's been naughty? If so, maybe you should put them on the naughty list. Perfect, I thought. This has to be it. I'll upload all my personal photos and videos there and maybe link her social media, and we'll see who's laughing then. I thought about adding her address, but she was living with her family again, and I wasn't going to go that far. However, the forum wasn't what I expected. You couldn't just upload to the front page. There were different sections, or punishments, as they called them. I remember thinking how dramatic it was, how silly and naive I was. There were several different sections: Elf on the Shelf, Krampus Cramps, and Frozen Fields, among others. It made me laugh a little, I guess. That's why I didn't think it was anything serious. Anyway, of the sections, Elf on the Shelf brought a smile to my face, but it wasn't the one I chose. I opted for something called Sleigh Snatcher. I don't know why, I just did. It seemed funny to me. After clicking on it, I had to wait a good minute and a half before a bright white page loaded, filled with some black text boxes and a message that said, "Santa's waiting for this report. Write their name on the naughty list. Please fill in the details and he'll do the rest." I thought to myself, how cute. I just thought it was something stupid, but I filled it out anyway. It asked for a name, age, date of birth, and links to the person's social media. Everything was there, everything I was so desperately looking for, and of course it asked to upload photos. Jackpot. I remember smiling to myself, almost laughing in the process. It didn't allow me to upload videos, but the photos were more than enough for me. They were hot girl summer type photos, if you know what I mean. It also asked for the person's address, but as I mentioned before, I wasn't willing to go that far, but I did write her hometown, our hometown, something I wish I hadn't done. After I finished entering her information, without a moment of hesitation, I clicked Submit. After a few seconds, a small text box appeared asking, "Are you sure? Santa doesn't forget, he checks that list twice, all names are final." With an arrogant smile, I pressed yes, and that was it. Perfect, I thought, until I was redirected to another page. It took a few minutes to load, but when it did, I was surprised. It simply said, "Thank you for submitting to the naughty list. We greatly appreciate it." I thought I had achieved my goal. Job done. Everything was uploaded. People would see them and send her messages on social media, then she would feel humiliated. Feeling like I had done the right thing, I turned off my computer and deleted everything properly, making sure they couldn't trace me or implicate me in any way. The next morning I woke up with the biggest, most disturbing smile I've ever produced. I was so pleased with myself. Looking back now, it honestly makes me sick. I couldn't wait to see the fruits of my labor. I was so excited to see her suffer. I wanted to destroy her and make her feel as worthless as she had made me feel. To my absolute amazement and disappointment, nothing happened. I waited and waited, but nothing. No angry phone calls, no angry text messages, no outraged social media posts, nothing at all. At first, I thought maybe she was trying to ignore it, or maybe she had reported the abuse and had been told not to engage with potential trolls or harassers. I mean, surely it had worked, right? There was no way I could check. I couldn't find that link again even if I tried. Anyone who has navigated the deep web or dark web knows this is true. It's simply not indexed, it's a mess, and I only found it by chance in the first place. I wish I hadn't. A few more days passed, and by then my excitement had faded, and I was genuinely upset that it clearly hadn't worked. No one could be that calm if it had worked, and I couldn't exactly ask her to check, that would just point directly to me. So after a while, I just gave up. Honestly, the whole thing seemed tiresome to me by then, and as sad as it sounds, it somehow made me feel better, like I had gotten it out of my system in some way. A few days later, I woke up to a loud knock on the door. The previous drama from my old relationship had completely left my mind at this point, and to give a little context, I live alone and don't get many visitors at all. So I was more annoyed than curious to see who was at my door. So you can imagine my surprise when I opened the door and was greeted by the stern faces of two police officers. Shit, I thought to myself, this is it, I'm going to prison. Everyone is going to think I'm a weirdo, which I suppose I really was at that point. They asked to come in, and of course I agreed. I said, "Go ahead." I remember thinking at that moment that they had only asked to come in, so at that point, I wasn't under arrest or anything, so I better see what they wanted. But what they asked me left me completely speechless. "When was the last time you saw Katie?" I was left speechless, and for a second I must have seemed like the most guilty and suspicious person in the world. Realizing this, I quickly wiped the look of surprise and fear off my face and answered with as much calm as I could muster. "Since we broke up about 2 weeks ago." This was true, but it didn't save me from their intense scrutiny and questioning. "Where were you the night of—" I told them the truth, at home. "Can anyone verify this?" I said no, I live alone, but that I get dropped off at home after work with a colleague, which is routine after every shift, so he could verify it, I guess. "What time was this?" I told the truth, around 10:30, and the cameras at work would show me leaving around 10:20, and that it's only a 10-minute drive to my house. "Did you leave your property at any other time after returning?" "No." I told the officers that there's a camera at the entrance to the apartment building that would show I was telling the truth. Their intense, focused expressions relaxed a bit, so I thought I'd take a chance and ask what this was all about. They stated that although they couldn't give me details about an ongoing investigation, Katie had been reported missing. Her mother last saw her leaving her house to go shopping and browse stores, but she never returned. The police officers left shortly after that and actually thanked me for my time. They checked the security cameras and talked to my boss and colleague, who confirmed my story and that I was telling the truth. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no news. It seemed as if she had just disappeared into thin air. I couldn't believe it. It couldn't have been my fault, I thought. Maybe it was possible that some stalker found her address after I posted her information along with the images, but surely it had to be a coincidence. That stupid forum couldn't be real. It said Santa's naughty list. That definitely couldn't be real. The longer time went on, the more horrible I felt. I know I wasn't physically responsible, but in one way or another I had caused this, or at least set the wheels in motion. I felt as guilty as if I had done something to her. I mean, this is the girl I once loved, the girl I still love, and I had done this, I had caused this, and her poor mother. They had been estranged for years. I tried to go on with my life as normal, but it was hard. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I knew I deserved it. I cringed every time I felt sorry for myself. I started drinking so I could sleep, anything to numb the pain, anything to get the image of her face and the sounds of her screams out of my head. I couldn't go to the police, but how could I? If I confessed, my life would be as good as over. As selfish as it was, I just didn't think it would help find her if I did. Maybe I was just being a coward, but it was useless. She was gone. I hoped every morning for an update. I always called the police station for a report. It was torture. Until one day they found her. But as I'm sure you can guess, this story doesn't have a happy ending. But eventually they found her in an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of the neighboring town. I just couldn't believe it. I could feel my throat tighten to the point where it was hard to breathe when I heard the news. In my head I was begging and pleading with whoever or whatever. It must be some kind of mistake, a mix-up. It couldn't be my fault, but unfortunately there was no mix-up. They found her stuffed in a chimney. Her body was inside a sack of toys. I couldn't believe it. I felt sick. It had to be some kind of sick joke. I kept trying to convince myself to no avail. I felt my body tremble. She had been there for a while, and you could tell just by looking at her. They knew it was her because inside her eye socket was a small piece of paper. A small piece of paper that said, "Naughty list, Katie, you should have been good." I fainted and collapsed where I stood, hitting my head hard. When I regained consciousness, I hoped and prayed that it was all just a bad dream. But of course it wasn't. It was real. Everything was real. I'm despicable. Nothing will ever make up for the torture I caused to a girl I once loved and cherished, all for my own ego, a misguided sense of pride and self-worth. I wish I could undo it all. You deserve justice, Katie. You deserve to rest in peace, at least. Maybe confessing will bring you and your family some closure. Maybe ending my own life would make us even. But regardless of the answer, I'm too much of a coward to do either. I won't go back to the dark web just because of this situation. I had retired a few years ago when I noticed that things were not quite right. At 60, you'd think you'd have a handle on life's surprises, but what I discovered about David threw me into a realm of darkness I hadn't imagined. David was always the quiet type, kept to himself, though he was a bright kid, a real maniac. He got a full scholarship to MIT and graduated at the top of his class. I was proud, of course, but at some point he changed, became reserved, and distanced himself from me and his mother. We thought it was just a phase, part of growing up, you know? Turns out we were wrong. The first sign was the strange packages. They started arriving a few years ago, brown boxes with no return address delivered to David's old room, which he hadn't lived in for years. He'd come to pick them up, always in a hurry, never staying to chat. I asked him about them once, and he brushed it off, said they were work-related. I didn't press, maybe I should have. Then came the call, an FBI detective asking if I knew where my son was. They were investigating him, said something about illegal activities on the dark web. I told them I hadn't seen him in months, but they left a number to call if I knew anything. That's when the doubts started gnawing at me. I'm no tech expert, but I can manage my way around a computer. I decided to do a little digging, see if I could find anything. David had left an old laptop at our house, so I turned it on. Of course, it was password protected, but he always used the same one, his mother's birth date. When the screen lit up, I had no idea what I was about to discover. Folders and more folders of files, videos, documents, photos. The more I clicked, the more my stomach churned. Experiments on people, real people. He called them subjects. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The videos were the worst, faces twisted in pain, bodies writhing. Some didn't make it, their lifeless eyes staring back at me through the screen. David was behind the camera, his voice calm, clinical. It was as if he had become someone else. I remember one file vividly labeled as Subject 13. A young woman in her 20s, maybe. David had her strapped to a table, tubes and wires everywhere. He was injecting her with something, narrating the process like he was presenting a cooking show. Her screams were muffled by a gag, but her eyes spoke, showing fear, desperation, agony. I had to stop the video. I couldn't watch anymore. I sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on me. My son, my own flesh and blood, was a monster. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. The FBI was an option, but would they believe me? Would they think I was involved too? I decided to confront David myself. I had to hear it from him, had to understand why. Tracking him down wasn't easy. He had gone off the grid, but I managed to find an old friend of his who owed me a favor. After a bit of persuasion, he gave me an address, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in a horror movie, all rusted metal and broken windows. I went there the next day, just after dawn. The air was thick with the smell of decay. I forced the door open and stepped inside. The sight that greeted me was straight out of a nightmare. Makeshift labs, operating tables, cages, bloodstains everywhere. This was where David conducted his experiments. This was his lair. As I ventured deeper into the warehouse, I found more evidence. Notebooks filled with meticulous notes, jars of chemicals, and more videos. I forced myself to watch one more, hoping to find something, anything that could explain his actions. It was worse than I imagined. He was experimenting with some kind of mind-altering drug, trying to see how far he could push the human psyche. The results were catastrophic. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like a moan. I followed it to a locked room at the back of the warehouse. Kicking the door open, I found her, a girl no older than 20, chained to the wall. She looked at me with vacant eyes, her body covered in bruises and cuts. I freed her, tried to comfort her, but she was too far gone. Whatever David had done to her had broken her mind. I called the FBI from there, told them everything. They arrived within an hour, swarming the place like ants. I watched as they gathered evidence, took the girl to safety. One of the agents, a woman named Rodriguez, pulled me aside. She thanked me for my cooperation, but I could see the suspicion in her eyes. They took my statement and then asked me to come to the station. As I sat in the interrogation room, waiting for what felt like an eternity, I realized that my life would never be the same. David was out there somewhere, and I knew he wouldn't stop until he was caught or dead. And as his father, as the man who raised him, I felt a responsibility, not just to the victims, but to David himself. I had to stop him, one way or another. Days turned into weeks, and the FBI's search for David intensified. They kept me informed, more or less. Agent Rodriguez would call every few days, updating me on their progress or lack thereof. They had some leads, but nothing solid. David had covered his tracks well. The raid on the warehouse had been just the tip of the iceberg. I couldn't sit and do nothing. Every night I found myself going through the files I had copied from David's laptop, searching for clues. There were so many questions. How had he become this person? What had driven him to such depravity? The more I dug, the more I realized how little I knew about my own son. One night, while combing through his emails, I found a thread that seemed different. It wasn't like the others filled with scientific jargon and experiment logs. This was personal, a conversation between David and someone named Dr. Herrera. Dr. Herrera, I heard you've made progress with the serum. How are the subjects reacting? David, the results are promising. The initial subjects showed significant cognitive dissonance, but I think I've refined the formula. Dr. Herrera, good. Remember, the goal is to push the limits, not just observe them. We need results that can change the world. David, understood. I have a new batch of subjects lined up. We'll see how they handle the next phase. Dr. Herrera, keep me updated, and David, don't let emotions get in the way. This is bigger than both of us. The exchange sent chills down my spine. Dr. Herrera, whoever he was, had a significant influence over David and was pushing him to go further, to cross more lines. I needed to find Dr. Herrera. I printed the emails and took them to Agent Rodriguez. She listened, her face serious. "We've been trying to identify Dr. Herrera for some time," she said. "We believe he's the mastermind behind several syndicates on the dark web, but he's a ghost. No real name, no face, nothing, just whispers and rumors." "So what do we do?" I asked, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. "We keep digging. Every piece of information helps. We'll figure it out, Mr. Whitaker. We have to." In the meantime, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I contacted some old acquaintances from my time in the military, guys who had gone off the grid and knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. One of those contacts, a man named Jose, helped me. "I'll see what I can find about Dr. Herrera," he said, "but it's going to take time. This guy is slippery." While Jose worked his magic, I continued my own investigation. I retraced David's steps, visiting places he frequented, talking to people who might have known him. It was like piecing together a puzzle, but with half the pieces missing. One day I found myself in a seedy bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions. I was nursing a beer, trying to blend in, when a man slid into the seat next to me. He was rough-looking with a beard and a scar on his cheek. "You're David's old man, right?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. I nodded, my heart racing. "Who's asking?" "Name's Mason. I used to run with David until things got weird." "Weird how?" He took a swig of his drink, his eyes scanning the room. David changed. Started talking about this guy, Dr. Herrera. Said they were onto something big, something that could change everything. Next thing I know, he's doing these experiments, crossing lines I didn't even know existed. I got out, didn't want any part of it. "Do you know where he is?" Mason shook his head. "Last I heard, he was heading to an old lab out in the desert, a place where they used to test nuclear bombs back in the day. Said it was off the radar, perfect for his work. A lead. It wasn't much, but it was something." I thanked Mason and left the bar, my mind racing. The desert made sense, isolated, away from prying eyes, the perfect place for David to hide and continue his twisted experiments. I called Agent Rodriguez, informed her of what I'd discovered. "We'll check it out," she said. "But be careful, Mr. Whitaker. If David's there, he won't be happy to see you." I packed a bag, grabbed my gun, and set out. The drive to the desert was long and monotonous, giving me plenty of time to think. Memories of David as a child flooded my mind. His first steps, his first words, the time he broke his arm trying to climb a tree. How had that innocent boy turned into this monster? The old lab was exactly where Mason said it would be, a relic of a bygone era, surrounded by miles of desolate land. I parked a distance away and approached on foot, the sun beating down on me. The place looked abandoned, but I knew it wasn't. As I got closer, I saw movement, shadows flitting past the broken windows. I crept up to one of the windows and peered inside. The sight that greeted me was both familiar and horrifying. Makeshift labs, operating tables, and David in the middle of it all, his back to me. He was talking to someone, who I assumed was Dr. Herrera, a tall man in a lab coat, his face obscured by shadows. I strained to hear their conversation. "We're close, David," Dr. Herrera was saying, "but we need more subjects, more data." David nodded. "I know. I have some leads. We can start the next phase soon." My blood boiled. They were planning more experiments, more suffering. I couldn't let that happen. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and kicked the door open. "David," I shouted, my voice echoing through the lab. He turned, surprise and anger flashing across his face. "Dad, what the hell are you doing here?" "Stopping you," I said, pointing my gun at him. "This ends now." Dr. Herrera stepped forward, a cold smile on his lips. "You must be Mr. Whitaker. I've heard a lot about you." "Shut up," I snapped. "David, you're coming with me. We're going to the FBI. This madness ends today." David's expression hardened. "I can't do that, Dad. You don't understand. This is bigger than you and me, bigger than all of us." "Don't give me that crap," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You're killing people, for God's sake. How can you justify that?" Dr. Herrera laughed, a chilling sound. "Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. David understands that." "Enough," I shouted. "David, please come with me. Let's end this." For a moment I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but then he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Dad, I can't." Before I could react, Dr. Herrera lunged at me, knocking the gun from my hand. We struggled, and I could feel his strength, his determination. But I was fighting for my son, for all the victims. I couldn't lose. With a burst of strength, I shoved Dr. Herrera off and grabbed the gun. I aimed, my hands trembling, and fired. The bullet hit him square in the chest, and he crumpled to the floor. David stared at me, shock and anger in his eyes. "You killed him," he whispered. "I had no choice," I said, my voice breaking. "It's over, David, please." He looked at me with a mix of sadness and defiance in his gaze. "No, Dad, this is just the beginning." With that, he turned and fled into the maze of the lab. I chased after him, but he was fast, and the labyrinth of hallways and rooms made it hard to keep up. I could hear his footsteps echoing, but they grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared altogether. I searched the lab for hours, but David was gone. He had vanished into the desert, leaving me with nothing but the remnants of his experiments and Dr. Herrera's corpse. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape, I realized the enormity of what lay ahead. David was still out there, still a threat, and I was the only one who could stop him. I drove back to the city, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I would find David. I would bring him to justice, no matter the cost, because in the end, he was still my son and I couldn't give up on him, not yet. In the days following the confrontation at the lab, the FBI launched an extensive manhunt to find David. They combed the desert, searched abandoned buildings, and monitored the dark web for any sign of his activity. Agent Rodriguez assured me they were doing everything they could, but I could see the strain in her eyes. David was always one step ahead, a ghost in the shadows. I returned home, a shadow of my former self. The house felt empty, haunted by memories of a simpler time when David was just a curious boy with a bright future. I spent hours staring at old photos, trying to reconcile the image of my son with the monster he had become. The guilt ate away at me, an unrelenting beast. How had I missed the signs? Could I have done something to prevent this? Weeks turned into months and the trail went cold. David had disappeared without a trace. The FBI's updates became less frequent, their hope dwindling. I tried to resume a normal life, but normalcy felt hollow, a facade that hid the darkness that had taken root in my soul. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had failed as a father, failed to protect my son from himself. One night I received a call from Jose, my old friend from the military. He had been working tirelessly, digging into the dark corners of the internet. He had found something, a new alias David was using, a new project he was working on. It was a thin lead, but it was something. I thanked Jose and immediately contacted Agent Rodriguez. She mobilized a team and we followed the lead to an old factory on the outskirts of a forgotten town. The factory was a decrepit ruin, its walls covered in graffiti, its floors littered with debris. As we entered, the air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. We moved cautiously, the silence oppressive. The further we ventured, the clearer it became that this was another of David's labs. We found evidence of his work, journals, jars of unknown substances, and more videos documenting his experiments. The images seared into my mind, each one a testament to the horror David had unleashed. At the heart of the factory, we found what we were looking for. David had set up a new lab, more sophisticated and even more sinister than the last. Operating tables lined the walls, each one stained with blood. In the center of the room was a large glass tank filled with a thick green liquid. Inside, a body floated, connected to a multitude of tubes and wires. It was one of David's victims, preserved in some grotesque experiment. As I stood there, staring at the tank, a cold realization washed over me. This was David's magnum opus, his masterpiece of horror. He had pushed the limits of human experimentation further than I could have imagined. The sight made me sick, but it also filled me with a grim determination. This had to end once and for all. The FBI swept through the factory, gathering evidence and searching for any sign of David. They found a hidden room, accessible through a secret door behind one of the operating tables. Inside were more notes, more plans, and a computer terminal. Agent Rodriguez accessed the terminal, and as the screen flickered to life, we saw David's face. It was a recorded message addressed to me. "Hello, Dad," he said in a calm, composed voice. "If you're seeing this, it means you've found my latest project. Impressive, isn't it? I knew you wouldn't give up. You're persistent, I'll give you that. But you're too late. I'm already gone, moving on to the next phase. You won't find me, but don't worry, I'll be watching. Goodbye, Dad. Years passed, each one blurring into the next. I grew older, but the memories remained as sharp as ever, a constant weight I carried with me. The FBI's search for David continued intermittently, but the trail had gone cold long ago. The dark web was an abyss where shadows thrived, and David was a master at navigating its depths. My new life in the small town was quiet, almost painfully so. The locals knew little about my past, and I preferred it that way. I kept to myself, spending my days tending to a modest garden and doing volunteer work at a local shelter. It was a simple life, far removed from the horrors of the past. But every night, as I lay down to sleep, the darkness returned, bringing with it the memories of David and his atrocities. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, I received an unexpected visitor. A young woman showed up at my door, her eyes tired but determined. She introduced herself as Emily, a journalist investigating cold cases and the dark web. She had stumbled upon David's name during her research and had tracked me down in the hope that I could provide some information. I invited her in, and we sat at the kitchen table, the remnants of daylight casting long shadows through the windows. Emily was thorough, asking detailed questions about David, his experiments, and the events that had transpired. I answered as best I could, reliving the nightmare once more. She listened intently, her eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and sadness. After hours of conversation, Emily revealed her findings. She had uncovered a series of recent incidents, eerily similar to David's previous work: disappearances, unexplained deaths, and whispers of a new alias. It seemed that David was still active, still pursuing his dark purposes. The news was a knife to my heart, reopening old wounds I thought had begun to heal. Emily's visit reignited a fire within me. I couldn't let David continue his reign of terror. I owed it to the victims, to the families shattered by his actions, and to myself. I decided to join Emily in her investigation, to track David down once more. This was my last chance to make things right. Together we delved into the depths of the dark web, following the breadcrumbs David had left behind. It was a harrowing journey, navigating a world filled with unspeakable horrors and moral decay. Emily's expertise in digital forensics and my first-hand knowledge of David's methods made us a formidable team. Months of relentless searching led us to a remote island off the coast of a forgotten country. David had set up a new lab there, hidden from the prying eyes of the world. The island was desolate, surrounded by treacherous waters and dense forests, the perfect hideout for a man who had become a ghost. We arrived under the cover of night, our boat cutting silently through the dark waters. The island loomed ahead of us, a silhouette against the starless sky. We disembarked, the weight of our mission heavy on our shoulders. This was it, the final confrontation. We moved cautiously through the forest, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and our own breathing. As we approached the lab, I saw the faint glow of lights filtering through the trees. The structure was a stark contrast to the natural beauty surrounding it, a cold, clinical building that exuded death and despair. Inside, we found more of the same: makeshift labs, operating tables, and David's meticulous notes. The place was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. We pressed on, deeper into the maze of rooms and corridors, our footsteps echoing in the silence. At the heart of the lab, we found David. He was standing in front of a large computer terminal, his back to us. He turned as we entered, a mixture of surprise and resignation on his face. He looked older, his sharp features now gaunt and worn, but his eyes still held that same cold determination. Without a word, I raised my gun, my hand steady for the first time in years. David looked at me, a faint smile playing on his lips. He didn't move, didn't try to escape, he just stood there, accepting his fate. I pulled the trigger, the shot echoing through the lab, a final punctuation to a story that had lasted far too long. David crumpled to the floor, his eyes staring at the ceiling, empty and lifeless. The monster was finally dead. Emily and I gathered the evidence, making sure that David's work would never see the light of day. We contacted the authorities, who arrived soon after to secure the lab and take our statements. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the island, I felt a sense of closure. The hunt was over, the darkness that had haunted me for so long was finally behind me. Returning to my small town, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had done all I could, fought to the end. David's legacy of horror had been extinguished, and I could finally begin to heal. In the years that followed, I found a new purpose. I continued to volunteer, sharing my story with those who would listen, hoping to prevent others from falling into the same abyss. I made peace with my past, accepting that some questions would never be answered. Life went on, and I embraced it, finding solace in simple pleasures and quiet moments. As I stood in my garden one sunny afternoon, watching the flowers sway in the breeze, I realized that despite everything, there was still beauty in the world, and I would hold on to that no matter what.